Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by CMeister. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It starts out with some game series doomsaying, but I actually am going to take this in a rather optimistic direction. CMeister begins talking about cyclical game series, you call them. You might think of Legend of Zelda. Other games that come to mind are the Pokemon series, Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto. Zelda is in a peculiar position because of its recent shift to open-world exploration and non-linear gameplay. If the game developers cannot innovate any more gameplay, are these types of games just destined to fizzle out or be looked over by other games? Are games like these just popular because of the characters / fanbase? More thoughts? Sure. So the idea is that, yeah, we've all had this feeling where a series begins to feel overdone. Something we're kind of familiar with begins to feel overdone. I have kind of three sections for this parlay. The first one, I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle of these franchises, because I think it is more interesting than it might at first appear. There's more going on than just they get burnt out. But I think that's absolutely a phenomenon. And what's happening when they start to get burnt out? What's going on? Why? The second thing is sort of purposes of a game series. What I mean is, besides marketing, obviously, people will buy a thing with a name they recognize on it, but why? And are there other reasons why a series of games would do well? Is literally everybody just a drone that will purchase anything with Legend of Zelda on it? I think no, which might surprise you. It sounds like I would be cynical and say yes, but I think no, actually. And therefore, what is sort of the fate of these game series? What happens after they fizzle out and are looked over, by the players as other games come out? Because that does happen, but that isn't the end of these series. The necromancy is next, and so we'll talk about that. That's the plan. Let's get started. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about was the sort of life cycle of these kinds of series. Some people might be objecting to how CMeister is referring to Legend of Zelda as having shifted to open world exploration and non-linear gameplay, because a lot of Legend of Zelda games previously could be argued to have that already. I would argue, for example, that non-linear gameplay is at least an atmosphere or like a feeling that a lot of the Legend of Zelda games have. In many cases, if you play through them once, they at least feel like you could be doing things in various orders. They don't feel incredibly linear. It's not made incredibly clear where you need to go next, map markers pointing your way and such. So I would argue that evolving the series to be much more decisively committed to that, the world is gigantic and incredibly open instead of like technically open in that you can go various places, doesn't really feel like that much of a shift as much as just a more extreme version of something that was already a core aspect of the series. Personally, I'm not all that keen to argue this because I don't know in Zelda games I've played. It may have been linear and I just didn't notice because it was framed as being sort of more open. But I think my point is that feels like a sort of a concept or in the word cloud of the Legend of Zelda franchise. And for me, there's going to be sort of three phases to the life cycles of these franchises. There's going to be their youth, we'll call it. We'll say the point of no return, when they begin to make changes that are not innovations. They've sort of perfected themselves, and then they still change, but now these are changes that don't really have to do with sort of growing, getting from youth to adulthood. They're getting older. And then they die, and we enter the necromancy territory, which again, we'll talk about later. Once they're fizzled out and looked over compared to other games, but don't end though, what happens after that? That would be that third phase. In other words, what I'm interested in highlighting is also the point before what CMeister is referring to, the idea that Zelda is in a really good place right now, but maybe this is the peak, and now we're going to continue to get innovations because they're going to keep making Legend of Zelda games because money, but the changes will no longer be as likely to improve it because this is kind of the penultimate version of the franchise, you could think. But I want to note how it feels like the games were maybe improving along the way up until that point. There's a period where I think the games innovating isn't them being done to death yet. They are generally improving. For many franchises, I wouldn't be willing to agree that the earliest examples of the game were the better ones. We have some examples, like you said, the Pokemon series. These games are notorious for innovating practically not at all for a ludicrous number of games. And then suddenly we got Pokemon Legends Arceus, which I would argue is what a lot of people kind of expected we were going to get from much earlier Pokemon games. There are some GameCube Pokemon games. I'm thinking of, it's called Pokemon Colosseum, which is, it's not at all an open world Pokemon game. It doesn't really change any of the mechanics of the series, but it could look like it did. You know what I mean? And you could imagine that those graphics, that format, could have been what Pokemon Legends Arceus is. If you're not familiar, you can walk around an open environment, see Pokemon in the environment, and kind of interact with them, getting into a battle with them seamlessly. You know, that you don't like stop and enter a battle scene, and then once the battle's over, you stop, get your rewards, and then move on. It's quite seamless. The moment the battle ends, you can keep walking. The instant the battle ends, you can keep walking. You're manually throwing Pokeballs, physically, mechanically operating, throwing Pokeballs to aim, maybe miss, maybe hit Pokemon. These mechanics feel like something that the series was always about, but just was low tech. It was doing it in a low tech way, you know what I mean? So while I definitely agree, I don't mean to be pedantic, like that is a shift of sorts. I would argue that it is a certain kind of shift, and that matters. It's the series doing the thing it always purported to be about, but like actually doing it though. You know what I mean? I'm not here to argue either, necessarily. I actually am totally here to argue this, whether it's better or not. In the Pokemon case, I think Pokemon Legends Arceus is the first Pokemon game that I'm actually sold that sounds fun. That sounds cool. That seems like a good idea. I want that. Zelda is a case where I like Breath of the Wild and those games, but whether that more developed version of the concept of exploring a world in a Zelda game is better, I don't know. I mean, there are clearly merits to both. Something about the puzzle box dungeons and puzzle boxy feeling world that is sort of open feeling, but it's actually fairly restrictive and you kind of figure out where to go. I'm thinking of Ocarina of Time or something. You can go a variety of places, but the world is extremely small in terms of total area. That's not really the point. The idea is it's kind of like you're in just a larger dungeon, just like the series' various dungeons. And that feeling may be a more concentrated feeling to some people. So I'm not necessarily saying I think the open-er world version is just better, but I'm pointing out that it definitely is a progression of an idea that the Legend of Zelda franchise has essentially always had, whereas there comes a breaking point at the end of the youth of a franchise, in my opinion, where we still get changes, but no longer are they in pursuit of the thing the franchise was reputedly about. To use the Legend of Zelda franchise as a continued example, I would argue, for example, that Age of Calamity, those games, are an example of a game that has absolutely nothing to do with Legend of Zelda from a game design perspective, literally zero to do with Legend of Zelda from a game design perspective. It's almost literally just Dynasty Warriors. It's arguably not even a different game than Dynasty Warriors, but it's from a flavor perspective, it's a Legend of Zelda game, which, not to be rude, it's interesting lore that the Zelda games have, but that is something done as an excuse to make it feel like a Zelda game so that it doesn't feel like a total cash grab to some people. But it is a total cash grab. I'm not commenting on whether you think it's fun. I'm just saying I think that's a game I would strongly argue is motivated literally only by making money. It's not in an effort to make a game at all, actually, let alone a new game or a Zelda-like game from a game design perspective. But that's not quite the same thing as the game adding innovations that just don't really feel like a thing the game was doing before. I think the best example of that is probably building in the Breath of the Wild games. I'm not necessarily saying this is bad, by the way. We'll get to that in a minute. But constructing like devices, building things in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom does feel like something that it's not immediately obvious how that is related to the Zelda series design document. Again, that doesn't make it automatically bad. It just means that we've crossed the point where the series has kind of maximized, is sort of finished adding, or mostly finished adding, I don't know, things that are part of its original design idea, and is now becoming something appreciably different rather than just more of what it was before. In Pokemon Legends Arceus, there are like boss fights where you dodge roll Pokemon attacking you, which that doesn't have anything to do with original Pokemon game design, right? Again, this doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but I do think that that's a big differential. That's a point of difference where things are now changing in a way that isn't like before. Does that make sense? And I think that's where Zelda and Pokemon, as it were, are. They're sort of at that interesting sort of middle-aged point where they're, if you want to put it positively, really innovating, actually. These are actual innovations rather than just things that, while they might feel innovative in that they are, like, getting better, they're getting to be more of what they were. It's not a bad thing, but you could argue that these games actually adding legitimate curveballs, being a kind of different game, while ideally being enough similar that you still like them if you enjoy Pokemon or Zelda games. You see what I mean? I think it would be surprising if people who liked Pokemon or Zelda mostly really disliked these games, because they feel like they are still mostly about the thing that the games were always about. Some people will dislike them. You can imagine complaints like, well, but there's just such a focus on moving around the world when that was really snappy previously in a Zelda game, for example. That's fine and all. I'm just saying generally, I feel like a lot of the design by mass or whatever, percentage-wise, is kind of the same. It's just sort of a more version of that. Again, whether that's good or bad, I'm not really here to say. Now, to put it another way, though, these actual innovations, the building in the Zelda series, the Dark Souls boss fights in the Pokemon Legends Arceus game, could be seen as more like mutations. In the beginning, the first Legend of Zelda game had like a whole bunch of game design decisions in it. The industry overall was literally just worse at making games, and there was a bunch of what would go on to feel random design decisions in the games. So if you made decisions at random about what would change in the Zelda games, you would be more likely to make something change for the better. Again, they didn't make changes at random, literally at random. But imagine if you did. You would be more likely to make changes that would make it more good instead of more bad, because a lot of the things in it weren't really correlating with a feeling of Zelda-ness. There was only one Zelda game after all. As more and more are released, keeping more and more things that kind of work from previous games, up until Breath of the Wild, we begin to get a game that is more and more pieces of very deliberately chosen, from many options, proven to be enjoyed by the audience, good pieces of game design. And the industry itself gets better at making video games. We arrive at Breath of the Wild. Now try changing something in the design at random. You're way more likely to make the game worse rather than better from a given player's perspective, because so much of the design is interlocking and serving a single purpose. So much of it is something we have largely agreed we enjoy as players, that you can see how if you change things, essentially no matter what you change, if you make every possible change, you're now far more likely to make the game a worse game, though you are also more likely to make the game feel like a different game, which isn't necessarily bad. But it's somewhat likely to be bad, don't you think? So I do think you hit a point where, yeah, like you can expect there to be a bumpy ride of changes. That's my summary for this first part. That the changes made to games at this stage of their life, where they've kind of come close to the peak of their original design idea, they're still going to get changed just as much, but now the changes are much more of a toss-up. You know, is this a good idea or not? There's not a lot of gameplay left to sharpen, because that's been done for like 30 years for these game franchises, right? Pokemon is 30 years old. Zelda's a little older. Is that true? Anyway, it's been a while, right? And that whole progression, I would argue, has largely culminated in these games. Now, Pokemon is not quite at this stage, I would argue. We've really only had one or two games that innovate at all on the mainline Pokemon games. There have been some tertiary ones. The Mystery Dungeon series comes to mind, and Pokemon Go, Pokemon Sleep recently. These are games that count as far as a franchise inclusion, but are not really the same progression. They're not trying to be the same design. So I'm really talking about the mainline Pokemon games, Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, and we go all the way up. And I would argue that Arceus is still in that line. It's just a meaningful innovation forward where there really haven't been as many. But Zelda had lots of these. You could look at something like, not Ocarina of Time, but the one with the time, Majora's Mask, where the game is on a timer, if you're not familiar with this game. You start out in a kind of time loop or a 3-day time cycle. It doesn't take 3 real days of time. And everyone dies and you start over if you don't do something about it by the end of that time period. I won't say how that develops, but it is a different type of framing device where you have a kind of time limit to figure your way forward in the puzzle box world that really isn't a feature of most other Zelda games. But otherwise, what you are doing in that time limit pretty much is the same as in other Zelda games. So that is a pretty interesting step forward rather early in the Zelda game franchise. You see what I mean? Anyway, cool. So to summarize, yeah, I would point there to being this kind of life cycle to these games. They sort of have a youth where they begin to reach the peak of the precision and completeness of their original design ideas, or what settles on being their design ideas over the first few games or something, you could imagine. And then there's a period of middle-agedness where changes continue, but now these changes are not as likely to make the game actually better at what it already is. Instead, they're more likely to make it different and worse, though not necessarily in the same way. Like there might be some different but really good ones, different in a good way, or some that are a change, but the change is basically just damage to the relatively perfected design idea from before. So now it's worth talking about why a game series, besides obviously money, and why money? Why does that make money? Let's start there before we wrap up by talking about the fate of these series. The why of the marketing. Well, people think that they will enjoy it because it will be like what they've played before. The core conflict here is that the marketing team is selling people the game, advertising it as being, oh, it's Pokemon, that thing you already know you like, but will reliably change it every single time. Well, Pokemon, not really, but the Zelda games, there's meaningful mix-ups each time. I think ideally the mix-up is fun for the player. It makes it unlike playing the same game they already played over again, but it's comfortable enough that them thinking, oh, I'll like this because this is a Zelda game, that's relatively spot on, ideally. The marketing team gets their money and pretty guaranteed sales from a franchise that's worked well, and the player gets an experience that's similar enough to what they liked that they will like it with all likelihood, or they'll like most of them in all likelihood. But it's also enough of a mix-up that it's not just playing the same game over and over again. Cough, cough, the Pokemon franchise is totally not doing this. But anyway, I think the Zelda games are a great example of this. They mostly are a similar idea, but different enough that it definitely doesn't feel like playing the same game, at least to me, most of the time. Now, you can definitely pick and choose which parts you feel like are really similar, really different. I would argue dungeon design actually varies a good amount between the Zelda franchise, like the philosophy behind dungeon design. But if we're being real, the majority of players by population doesn't at all think about or notice that kind of thing, at least in a way that they would be able to put to words. So I'm not sure it's totally fair to argue that these games are like actually way different because the philosophy of the puzzle design is like a big change, you know? I think that matters, but I think relative to the changes you could have made, they are still pretty similar games. It's a puzzle of a kind. It just might be a different kind of puzzle, you know? I don't want to be unfair and act like, well, from a game design perspective, it's actually highly technically different. Like, okay, sure, sort of. It is, kind of. Dungeons in these games don't always follow the same design philosophies. but it's kind of disingenuous to act like it's so different that you would, despise one approach and love another unless you already had a pretty strong opinion about this subject, which I think a lot of consumers do not, and that's perfectly fine. So in terms of marketing, I would argue that the Zelda franchise is doing maybe the best version of this, where the consumer actually does arguably benefit. They do get something they reliably like that actually has meaningful innovation, like a good amount of the time, and the marketing team gets reliable money for making something actually good. Like, that's good. So in this case, I feel like it's a win-win. It usually isn't, is obviously what I'm implying. Again, I think in the Pokemon games, you have a series that is unbelievably stagnant because they're terrified of changing anything or they won't make the money. The development team must be a bit bored, and you can imagine. And the audience ends up hyper-focusing on tiny changes because it's easy to notice those things when you have like 50 practically identical games to compare to. Oh, you're telling me in the Call of Duty franchise, in this game, it takes one more body shot to kill, but your weapon has 10 rounds per second or whatever, and you can tell the difference? It takes 0.1 of a second longer to kill someone, and you can tell the difference? Well, you can probably tell the difference a lot easier because you just played a game that is almost exactly the same, except that the time to kill is a little bit different. You're making it easier to tell the differences. Again, this could be seen as good. The games kind of get free innovation a little bit because smaller changes that maybe take less effort are more noticeable because of the point of comparison, because the game is a franchise. But I think this is often bad. It means that things that would maybe in the grand scheme of things not really seem like a huge deal breaker in a game become things that feel like a big issue because the game was otherwise so similar, and then they changed this one thing, and you end up complaining a lot, understandably, about something that feels really different but is barely actually different, and then it's any tiny change feels like an explosion of difference. I don't know if that is actually that good, but it kind of sounds like you get to innovate for free. That's maybe a topic for another time. That's sort of interesting. Anyway, purposes for game series other than marketing, other than just money. I just have a few thoughts. Developing design in different directions is one of them. The idea that you're developing a game in its early life stage that I talked about in the first section, up to a sort of peak where it's its sort of optimal form of design. Well, but there could be multiple of them. For example, Pokemon Legends Arceus flirts with having these open world Pokemon battling and catching encounters, both with turn-based combat and with some live action, like mobile combat. The idea of riding your Pokemon around, too, that's a feature of some other games, but I feel like more of a realized feature in the Arceus games, and that feels more like your Pokemon are kind of breaking out of the turn-based combat model. To me, as an example anyway, those kind of feel like two different design branches. You could do them in the same game, but you can imagine how, I'm sure, a major complaint for people who kind of like Pokemon Legends Arceus is that those things feel like kind of different games. Do you want to play Dark Souls and Pokemon at the same time? Probably no, for a lot of people. You can have games in games, but having them both be turn-based, for example, it seems sensible, so the audience can like one thing and reliably have that experience be about that general thing. That seems okay. It's not necessarily inherently bad to have turn-based combat in a game that isn't all turn-based combat, but I think you get the point. You could imagine that those are worthwhile independent branches to pursue, and you can do that a lot more easily from a marketing perspective, from the perspective where you can kind of brand one series as maybe the Pokemon Legends games or whatever, become a more live action offering, and the mainline Pokemon games stay as a kind of turn-based thing. You get the consumer benefit of them being able to find things that correlate with what they enjoyed, but you also get to reliably sell new stuff that is less stale and prone to getting old because you actually do get to make changes. You can make more different things without making it unclear what you're going for in those individual things. That's not so bad. There might legitimately be a good reason to make many games in a series. The Zelda games have had a lot of, I think, perfectly cool interesting, inspired game design mix-ups. Some that weren't inspired, sure, but I personally think that a good number of those games have had good game design ideas. And I don't think those design ideas need to be a completely different game. They feel like good ideas for a Zelda game, but that doesn't mean you need to put all of them in the same game. You see what I mean? I think building is a bit of an innovation on the franchise, I said earlier, but you could also argue that that actually kind of makes sense because there's a good amount of moving around an open world or an open-ish world. We had Epona having a mount, your horse, in Ocarina of Time, pretty early on. So it's not that weird that you would build mostly vehicles, you know. It sounds weird, you build devices to fight enemies, well, but it's primarily vehicles, so that kind of makes sense. But you get the idea. If you had a game where you collect the ocarina songs, and you've got the timer from Majora's Mask, and you get the masks from Majora's Mask, and you've got the Rod of Seasons from Oracle of Seasons, and you build a rocket-powered minecart in Tears of the Kingdom, but those are all in the same game, it feels like, I don't know, those are all good ideas, but I don't really think they should all be in the same game. So that is, in my opinion, a pretty justified reason to have a bunch of different games that are all a good game design formula, the Zelda games, I guess, but they have, you know, various amounts of those pieces of design. I'm sure someone will somehow argue that there actually is a game that has essentially all of that stuff in it. But anyway, you get my point. Another point, similar, it can be fun to progress through the evolution of these games. If the game does it well, the Zelda franchise maybe, it can be kind of fun to follow along as there are sort of innovations as you go. An example I really enjoyed is that is it Oracle of Ages that does this? There's a Game Boy Zelda game fairly early on in the franchise where you ride various creatures, like Moosh is a big flying blue bear that you use to kind of unlock traversal abilities in the environment. You can get over obstacles you couldn't before when you ride Moosh, and there's a few other companions like that. Very loosely, this feels connected to the idea in Twilight Princess, where you have kind of different modes of combat between being the wolf and Midna is fighting with you versus being on foot. That is interesting to me, that those were in the same series, and they feel like, there's this element of Link having companions that's sort of interesting, and I think kind of revisited throughout the franchise. That's kind of a tertiary piece of game design. That can be fun to follow along with. I'm not sure if I'm just being a game design nerd when I say that, but I don't know, isn't that kind of fun? And the final thing I wanted to say is sort of actually similar to a previous one now that I think of it. It's the idea that you can kind of boost an idea for game design that wouldn't otherwise have been that likely to catch on because it is sensible to include it in a game's franchise that's already popular. Like the building thing, for example. I think a good amount of players have bounced off titles that have added this kind of thing in. A simple example would be there's a Banjo-Kazooie game that just added building, but it feels very random to a lot of people in that game. Just like, why? What? It just seems out of left field. You could view it as being pretty out of left field in the Zelda games, but I think because the series did a fairly good job, in my opinion, but also it kind of embraces the puzzliness. I think that's part of why it's working. It kind of feels like a puzzle mechanic a little. And so that feels weirdly in like the word cloud of the Zelda games. This is just a theory off the top of my head. I don't know. Maybe that's why it worked a little bit more. And I think the idea of building vehicles is a really cool thing in game design. So using a series that is likely to do well unless you really mess it up, to get that piece of design to do a little bit better isn't so bad. It's interesting to see when a series that has kind of done things well in the past, but then innovates a piece of design, makes that design type popular. For another example, I think we're going to see a lot more games that do the kind of Hades trick, where the dying and coming back to life for the gameplay loop is part of how the story is told. Like the format of the storytelling becomes, it's very direct, but it's told through what was just the gameplay contrivance of dying and coming back to life. A good number of games have a lore reason why you die and come back to life. That's very common. But Hades uses it as a primary emotional plot point where you have to deal with how your relationships with various characters change as you literally run away and come back over and over again. Having that be a more emotional aspect of the game's storytelling is something I think we're going to see more of. And I think Hades much more decisively focuses on story than a lot of these games, which I would describe as usually having atmospheric storytelling. Dark Souls, Dead Cells, these are games that do a storytelling thing that is not in the background as in it doesn't matter at all, but I'm just saying they're not directly focusing on dialogue that explicitly explains what's going on and the emotional pathos of that situation. You know what I mean? Hades is a more directly told story using very difficult combat where you die a lot and the loop of repeatedly coming back to life and doing a run over and over again. I think that's something you'll see more, and Supergiant killed it enough. Yeah, boo. Supergiant did a good enough job for a lot of people. The game was received well, that I do think that will be seen more. But you can imagine how that might have seemed really at odds with that gameplay loop to some. I've heard some people complain about that, actually, but it might have been sold better because this game was just really good and was, it's not really a franchise, but Supergiant Games is a developer that is kind of doing similar things with some of their titles. Bastion, Transistor, and Hades movement feels connected. Pyre is the odd one out. Let's save that for another time. Okay, so there are some good reasons for franchises. It's not just that it makes a ton of money. There are some legitimate benefits to having a franchise worth of games, but we all know where this is going. The thing that CMeister is posing as the main question for the Parley is, okay, so what's going on with games progressing like this? But we all know that what's gonna happen is it's gonna die. They're gonna make a bunch of changes long after they have any good changes to make money. People are understandably lazy because it's complicated to find games you like, so they're gonna keep trying to play these games long after it doesn't really make any sense to expect that they'll be what they're looking for, and thus the game will kind of grind itself into the ground. The franchise will sort of stop making any sense, fizzle out, and get looked over. But that is not the end. The franchise will then be necromancy resurrected for more money. It's now time, yes it is, to talk about remakes, unfortunately. I don't like this trend very much. A lot of games have been remade recently, and some of them it's a little bit comical. Like one of the Last of Us games getting remade feels just weird to me. Maybe, I'm sorry if that's makes total sense to people who like those games. It just feels like that really didn't come out long enough ago for that to be a thing that makes that much sense. A lot of them are literally just a port, like you could play it. It's kind of a monetization remake. I think of some of the Paper Mario games, for example. It's not all that difficult to play those games if you emulate them, but like that doesn't make Nintendo money, and so if they then release them, maybe they'll be different or look really good or whatever, but I think the primary motivation is just they can be making money off of you playing the game, which you already actually could do fairly easily. Not that I would know. Anyway, so there's that discussion. Now, I'm not saying that a remake always has to be bad. There could be a case where it kind of unlocks a lot of what could have been good about the experience, but is just kind of held back by older hardware. Many games may have tried to have grown to their peak of youth, where they've kind of found the final form of their game design ideas, but the technology for that idea simply wasn't there at the time. And so remaking them might unlock a huge amount of fun that wasn't there before. In some cases, I think it isn't technology. I think it's that the designer has an idiosyncratic idea that holds the game back a lot more than it seems like it would. And if you just change that one thing, the game would unlock a lot of fun. And it's not that we can't do that now, it's just that it might take hindsight, some perspective, to see, oh my goodness, you could change this tiny thing and it would be really, really fun. An example I harp on a lot is in Arknights. There's this mechanic where some of the game modes available are these really long encounters. It's a tower defense game, and a lot of it is incredibly bite-sized, like 2 minutes maybe for an encounter, which is, I think, a strength of the game. They're like little action-y puzzles. and you have to use your operators to just barely survive waves of oncoming enemies for a short but relatively intense period of time. It's fun. That's a great loop. There are various different modes or kind of remixes of that design idea, and one of them that I think is really noteworthy are annihilations. These are much longer instead, holding out against oncoming enemies. Well, it sounds cool to have it be that sometimes you do that for quite a while. It can't be too long because it's going to be time consuming for the player to actually play, but it's a fun idea in theory. Now, if you play annihilations and you complete them, you get currency that you can use to get more characters and stuff. It's a valuable currency. And so people will go through these every week to get their weekly currency in the game. It doesn't take too long. If you cleared one all the way through before, you can just quickly get the rewards. You don't have to go through the whole thing again. So it isn't very grindy. But the frustration for me is that there's a mechanic where when you clear for the first time, every 25 of the 400 enemies you kill, you get rewards, one time only for your first clear. Trying to get further and further on a really hard annihilation could be really fun if you just got that currency for the week. You were filling up your limit for that currency for the week as you went. But they just don't do that for some reason. It doesn't really make any sense. So unlike everywhere else in Arknights, if you try to do better in an annihilation that you haven't cleared yet, but you don't clear it all the way, you fail, you get nothing whatsoever. There is no other piece of content in the game that does this. The game frequently refunds you for your attempted things, at least the resource you use to attempt the mission. But for this one place, it just doesn't. I cannot see a reason why not. I could imagine that something like that, just in hindsight, you would see the fun it would unlock. It goes from being an absolute complete waste of your time to being you can try your best, and however far you get your weekly cap of resources. So it becomes fun and perfectly viable, rewarding, to just try your best and get further. I don't know why this isn't done. It's something that just feels like the game's own design ideas say that is a good thing to do. You could imagine that if Arknights kind of ends, the developer looks back, maybe it would be easier to see that that's a glaring change in the design direction that wasn't there before. That might seem like a contrived example, it took too long to explain, but the point is, some of these things may improve in hindsight simply because the developer gains a different perspective on that piece of design, not because it was like impossible to do before or whatever. Another simple example of a technology-based one would be our graphics technology has just gotten way better. It doesn't really matter that much for some types of games, but there are games in the past that were made when we had bad graphical technology, but it is a fairly large feature of those games, and you could just redo them and pull out all the stops nowadays. You see what I mean? You could do it, or they had a way to do it, but you could do that in a way that they would have enjoyed more. Now and again, you see this with, like, for example, there's a Resident Evil game that is a really clever way of doing graphics on the GameCube of all things, where the scenes are like pictures. I don't totally understand, but the scenes are cleverly hidden as 3D looking photographs, basically, so that it looks like you're in an ultra detailed environment when actually it's just an image, not a rendered polygon or anything, with very, very carefully sculpted lighting, and you kind of move around the scene. That's a really cool technique, but you could imagine how awesome it would be if you could just make it be a 3D environment, and on today's hardware, that wouldn't be very hard. These are not particularly aggressive environments to depict with today's technology. So it would be interesting to see how, like, the fixed camera in those games, well, that's required because it isn't a polygon, right? It's not a 3D environment, it's a picture. So you have to have a fixed camera in that Resident Evil game because you can't, the environment's like not real as per se. It's not a rendered graphic. It's well, it is a rendered graphic. It's not polygons. It's not a 3D object. But now it can be, which means you don't need the fixed camera, and I would argue that it mostly probably improves your experience of those games if you have the mobile camera. Now, in the very same breath, I'm going to say that there are cases where maybe the limitations bred not even creativity, just something that ended up being a very signature part of the game experience. In that Resident Evil game, for example, Well, the fact that there's a fixed camera makes the game feel weirdly claustrophobic. Like, I would argue this really isn't ideal because it's claustrophobic in a way that feels kind of janky instead of necessarily scary. But you could argue that that is part of the feeling of those games that does add to the tension. It's certainly different and not just literally better to have a 3D environment compared to having like an image in a fixed camera. You see what I mean? The Ocarina of Time environments have the same fixed camera thing, and I would argue that adds to some of the feeling of the world in a way that you wouldn't get if you were just running through a market, having the fixed camera in Hyrule Town Square, for example. That is a feeling that you get, and removing that may or may not actually feel like an improvement to the game. Personally, I like when remakes change stuff like that because we already have the other version of the game. The game pulled off the clever trick. We have that. You can play Ocarina of Time that way. You can play that Resident Evil game, the Resident of Evil. So you can grammar yourself to death in this new version and enjoy the various quirks it might have, and contrast to those versions rather than changing like the gameplay, the story, to be something completely different. I'm kind of interested in a reinterpretation of achieving the same design idea. That's kind of cool. That seems sort of fun. If you're gonna replay a game you know anyway, I'm more interested in playing it like that, possibly. Again, if we can play the version from before. Sometimes remakes are motivated by being unable to play it. Obviously, most of the time they're motivated by money, but I think it's worth mentioning that all of this messiness and design as the game grows up to be this interesting phenomenon and then gets older with all these crazy mutations as innovations are increasingly questionably actually in the name of fun, the series then dies, and then what you have to resurrect is a surprisingly weird lineage for that game series. I think that's kind of good. I think that's kind of good. I think most games are not that great. A lot of games are cash grabby big business nowadays. But I think when you look past that and look at games that, to be blunt, we would actually expect to be good, those games, I think them being a series is pretty good. I don't think that they fizzle out and get looked over as much as iterate. You used the term cyclical games at the very beginning, CMeister, and I personally think that that is a weirdly good term in context. At first I thought, no, it's just a game series. But when you look at it, no, I think the good thing is it is a cycle a lot of the time. Things go back to their roots, fall in and out of fashion, and as long as the game is motivated by an actually good core design idea, and the developer is not doing something blatantly completely different than that, that's cool. I think that's interesting. I would love to talk, if we had more time, a little bit about the abstract ways that games can follow their franchise. An example I would use in particular is Persona 5 and then Persona 5 Strikers. Looks like a very different game. It's actually doing a kind of Dynasty Warriors riff like I dunked on Zelda doing earlier. But in that case, there's something quite interesting, in my opinion, about the way that that kind of embraces the game's combat and reimagines it in a different form. I would argue that the combat in Persona 5 actually isn't defined by being turn-based, even though it is always except here turn-based. That I think there's something interesting going on there where it's a much more abstract version of reaching like the pinnacle of the game's design. We only really talked about games as examples in today's parlay that pretty linearly approached the kind of final form of their design. None of them made like a drastic reimagination of the design that actually works. And I don't think there are a lot of examples of that, but there are a few in my opinion. And I think one of them is the Persona 5 and Persona 5 Strikers games. Seemingly very different games that I actually think from an ideological perspective are quite similar. It's really the same idea still. That's just my 2 cents anyway. It would be my $9 if you decide that you want me to talk about that in the future. Thanks for asking for this parlay. Thanks for your patronage. I appreciate the support. You want to get your own parlay, you can check out how to do that in the description.